the book is about the healing story. It's not about the trauma story. And
Yeah.
we need a break from that. Like when
Yeah.
we are doing healing work and we're engaging, we're like, especially we're in talk therapy and we're grappling with the narrative, we can start to feel like we are our trauma. We are not.
Mm-hmm.
We are never
Mm-hmm.
our trauma. That is one thing that has happened in our life and that we're working to integrate into our story. That is way less interesting than to me than what your favorite dessert is.
What does it take to put your life's work out there in a really big way? How much can I do with this one precious life? Welcome to The Selfish Gift.
A lot of people who write a nonfiction book start out very focused on the information that they're sharing and what the reader will get out of it. And that's great. But what they might not know at the outset is that the act of writing itself can open up totally new worlds of opportunity for us as creative beings and even bring us closer to ourselves and help us to heal our own wounds. My guest today describes herself as a closeted writer of personal essays since adolescence. And it wasn't until she set out to write a how-to book at the age of 40 that she found the courage to share her creative side with the world. And now there's no stopping her. Laura Khoudari is a pioneer in trauma-informed strength training and the author of Lifting Heavy Things, Healing Trauma One Rep at a Time, which I had the privilege of publishing in 2021. Laura's work has been featured in the New York Times, NPR, Buzzfeed, Upworthy, Elephant Journal, and many other outlets. Laura, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me. I'm so excited to be here with you.
So you have called yourself an unlikely fitness professional who would rather read than run. Tell me about what kind of fitness professional are you and what do you do?
Sure. Yeah. I changed careers in my late 30s and became a personal trainer, very specifically to bring an aspect into the gym of trauma-informed personal training. I really did it. I was moved to take this big step and do it, not so much because I wanted to be the personal trainer, but because I really wanted to affect change in the industry as a whole. I learned through my own experiences of being somebody who found sport late in life. That's what makes me unlikely. It was not until my 30s that I was like, I had spent my whole life being like, I'm unathletic. I don't like to compete. I don't belong in the gym. And just working out to manage some chronic pain. And in my mid 30s, I found barbell sports, and specifically starting with Olympic weightlifting. And it shifted my whole life, and it made me alive. I loved it. And not too long after I really fell in love with this sport, I experienced my own trauma, and it really turned my life upside down. And I realized that a lot of trauma symptoms, especially as I started to learn and be able to name what was going on, were being worsened by my training. Things were coming up at the gym and no one knew how to deal with it. And I started saying to people, as I learned, I read The Body Keeps the Score was a brand new book and I was like, oh, this might help me. And I started to learn much more about the physiology of trauma. And I began to see myself in these studies and in these books. And I was like, oh, and thinking about what I knew just from having become basically a gym rat, was what I knew about exercise science. I was like, these go together. But I found that a lot of what I was saying was falling on deaf ears. And I was like, well, this has to be a thing. And I found one person in doing it in Toronto.
This meaning trauma-informed
strength training.
So let's do this in a way that can help you rather than make things worse.
Or at least, sort of support the nervous system of somebody with trauma. That was the thing. I was look, if you don't even want to engage in a healing practice, that's cool. I understand you signed up to be a trainer or a coach, but you're actually harming your clients and it's affecting their performance and it's affecting their health. And I wanted to make a space for a more inclusive environment for folks who are coping with trauma, because most of us encounter something at some point in our lives, and the gym can actually be this wonderfully healing and empowering place. So I just
Okay,
decided
not
to
for
start doing
me,
work.
but okay.
Movement, we go and I explore movement in different ways, but for me it had been really empowering, and so I was like, let's change this, let's make space. And I found other people, we built community, we've collaborated, and in the years since, there's now this real understanding and conversation within fitness about what trauma-informed approaches can look like, bringing a trauma-informed framework, and how that can be really helpful. And there are studies being done, and it became a thing, which is what I really wanted.
That's incredible. Well, you're either in a zeitgeist or, at the vanguard of a movement, or, and I just think that's so amazing. And what you're talking about with trauma-informed strength training, and that you go into detail in lifting heavy things, is how to use trauma-informed strength training, or actually any form of exercise as the phrase is embodied movement practice. And that is what can make it not just a safe thing to do if you are healing from trauma or living with trauma, but actually perhaps even a healing thing to do. So if you're like a person like me who does not go to the gym or lift heavy, like physical objects, but I like yoga and I like walking, how can I to practice my yoga or do my hiking, what does it mean to have an embodied movement practice?
Oh, sure. Yeah. It's interesting. And it's actually interesting that you mentioned yoga, right? Because here, in the West, when people hear embodied movement practice, if they have any association, it's generally something like yoga. And what I wanted people to understand was that yoga is, or when it's done as intended, is an embodied movement practice. The thing is that yoga doesn't, yoga often asks us to be still in some capacity, and stillness doesn't always feel safe to folks who have experienced certain traumas. And you need to feel safe in order to really engage with the movement practice for a physical, emotional, mental wellness. So if you don't feel safe in yoga, and that had been my experience actually as somebody who had a regular yoga practice, I was like, this is not working for me. But you don't have to do yoga to do embodied movement or mindful movement, right? Which is another way to talk about it. It can be anything. And the way you do it is really about the intention you bring. And it's a small shift. It's not as easy as it sounds, but it's essentially bringing your focus while you're performing a movement, whether it's a walking movement or a bicep curl, and picking some part of your body that you're focusing on while you're moving through that movement, and really keeping your attention there. And it sounds easier than it is a lot of the time. But it is a form of mindfulness where you have your object of focus, in this case, part of your body. And when you notice your attention wanders, which it always does, that's the moment of practice. That's actually the good stuff, is catching it and without judgment, bringing it back to the object of focus and to keep going. That's
so
a big
like
part of the practice.
my musculature becomes the flickering candle flame. So instead of like gazing in a fixed spot, I'm just tuning into my interoception, feeling my body, what it feels like to be in my body. And that's where embodied movement practice can be powerful for people who live with trauma, and also needs to be handled very sensitively, right? Because what we know about trauma is that it lives in the body even more than it lives in the stories of our mind. And that one of the things that people who have experienced trauma tend to do as a coping mechanism, even unconsciously, is dissociate, right? So we're actually kind of not in our body. And what I learned in reading the book and working on the book is that we can sort of like flip out and dissociate from our bodies in the middle of exercise without even realizing it. And if we do, we can hurt ourselves. So this, you you gave a really great example. I think it was a case study of one of your clients in the book about I think it was like a shoulder muscle or something where she was just, when you moved that muscle, you could see that she was moving it differently than her other shoulder, and that there was some trapped energy in there and she wasn't even aware of it. Can you talk to us like how that works?
Sure. Yeah. And when I've worked with clients in the past and I watch them move, you can see, I mean, sometimes even on myself, it has been extreme. I've actually had a shoulder thing where it was like, oh, when you stop to look at it, one side of my back was significantly more developed. And you wouldn't like see it in my clothes, but like when I was working out, my coach noticed it. It was like, oh, she's only using her left. And I felt like I didn't know, until I brought my awareness to it. And so what can happen is we can have parts of our body where, for a variety of reasons, we check out of it. Generally can be like an old holding pattern. It's uncomfortable to go there. That's where we put the story. That's where we put the stress. Sometimes it's a direct translation. It's like, yeah, there was an injury there. Something happened there. Sometimes it's a habit. And so we start to put it there, even though maybe we don't know the story. Doesn't matter. We don't need to know the story to work with it. We can just see like, oh, this person is disconnected from their body in this spot. And you start to work to slowly, and that's like the key, is to slowly start to help, in this case, my client reconnect with her shoulder. And it's literally a practice of like trying to be in touch with it. And the reason you want to go slow is that there is a possibility of a story in there, or energy, or, nervous system charge is how I often think about it. It's being held there and then you're dissociating to stay safe. That is a valid coping skill. However, it becomes maladaptive if it starts to lead to injury. So you have to very gently, a little bit at a time, start to connect with that. Because if you go real hard, which a lot of people like to do, they want a catharsis, or they want to really just like get in touch with it and power through. And, they'll pursue a lot of soft tissue work, or like aggressive soft tissue work,
like
to start to feel it.
That really like deep digging in. Yeah.
So they're like, I'm trying to feel this part. My therapist or my coach or whatever, they can see that I'm not connected to this part. I'm going to get connected with this part. And it's overwhelming, because all of a sudden you've gotten connected with all the stuff that you are trying not to connect with to stay safe. And then it's all at once. You're going to disconnect again. So it's
you
like
have no way to process it. And what's interesting about that is like what you just described is almost like the psychology equivalent of the typical gym mindset, which is just, no pain, no gain, suck it up, go hard, even the idea of, exposure therapy as it is misunderstood, which is just like, just do it, just face it, just, drive across that bridge, touch that spider, and it's like, no, that's not always going to get you over the fear. It can actually exacerbate it and drive it deeper.
Absolutely.
Whatever, the wound.
Yes. And I know a lot of the time people are very well intentioned, even when they're trying to help. I've met people who, another thing is sort of not considering the motivation behind a certain approach to fitness. And so I know people who will just really encourage their clients to come in and just like the client, you come in like, I definitely have walked into the gym like raging, like I want to smash stuff, right? That's how I am. That's fight. That's what's coming up. And so people will be like, yeah, let's do it. Let's get it out. And all it does is jack your nervous system up more. You don't actually get it out. And there's a time and a place for that. That's okay if you're doing it safely.
But you're not actually necessarily going to find any lasting relief from it, or a soothing, or a dialing down. It's you might just be kind of indulging in it and whipping it up.
Yeah, I always felt like I would leave the gym more like Hulk than I came in. And that's okay, but it's not going to help you. Whereas if you were to slow down, and one thing I like to do with, if you've got that sort of charge, is to actually, if you are somebody who works with heavy weights, to take that weight and move instead of like, I'm going to crush it fast, move really slow with it, which that's
Uh-huh.
hard. It's hard to do a slow squat. But if you're moving slow, you're really feeling yourself in your body. You're really feeling your muscles work, and you're really using that fire and that fight, but in a much more controlled, it's a slow burn as opposed to just this like, it's a podcast. I don't know. People don't see my gesture, maybe, as opposed to an explosion. I suppose is what that means.
Check it out on YouTube. If you're listening on audio, go to YouTube and see Laura's her hand movements to do with explosion. Very, very expansive. Well, I mean, I love the work that you do, and I really, really enjoyed the book so very much and see the need for it. I'm a person who lives with trauma too. There were lots and lots of moments, even just reading the initial manuscript where I felt, emotional and at times a little overwhelmed. And then what I loved is that then I would get, just at the point when I needed it, you would have this sort of little pause that you wrote into the manuscript saying, I invite you to take a pause right now, take a deep breath and look around the room, notice where you are. And I wouldn't have even realized like how much I had started to kind of like wig out, get triggered, holding my breath, tight shoulders, bracing myself. I didn't even notice it until you said, take a pause. And so even just like the way that the book is written is conscious of that. It's like a trauma informed written book.
That was really important to me. I, as somebody who has read a lot of these books, who's done trainings very specifically in, somatic experiencing and other modalities where what are we doing? We're talking about trauma. We're talking about other cases, people's stories. And like, I have a lot of opinions on that. But one thing we can do is sometimes it is really necessary to go into that sort of depth and explore, but it needs to be contained because even as a student of these things, I would find it was really hard to learn because ironically in some of these trainings, it's not actually, they don't use a trauma-informed framework to build a container and make you, help you stay within whatever your capacity is, your sort of nervous system capacity. I talk about it as the window of tolerance in the book and sort of been moving away from that model to a very similar, but this idea of thinking about capacity as opposed to tolerance. And so I wanted that for the book. And also, what you noticed is what you noticed. And I think that noticing aspect, like bringing in, like taking time to just start to build some self-awareness about like, oh, how does, how am I holding tension or stress or trauma in my body? Because I think we don't even notice we're doing it. We're so used to powering through. So just building space when I'm like, I know I'm talking about something that's charged in this part of the book. I bet for some of the readers, it's hitting a nerve. So let's see how they are. Let them see how they are.
Absolutely. And as you said, so much of it is about just noticing. And I think that the noticing is deeply connected to just, again, just being present to what is and being able to hold it without, again, pulling out, dissociating, withdrawing, just to sort of say, what is going on inside of me right now, and to acknowledge it. That in itself is soothing, because one of the, I think it's the tagline that we put on the back of the book, your body can be a vehicle for emotional healing, which is such, so creating a safe place, making the body a safe place to be, making the body a safe place to live. And so much of that comes from just being able to say, I am feeling this right now. I am here, and just being present to your own experience. It's remarkable how unfamiliar that feels to most of us.
We often make the mistake that we think our feelings. So they're not called thinkings. They're called feelings. And they're called feelings because they start as sensations in the body, right? Like when we think about terms like butterflies in the stomach, or, there's all sorts of, we generally, if we start to pay attention, some people are doing it already, some people learn, you might think, I feel anxious. This is a big one for me. So that's why I use this example. I'll be like, my default setting is I sort of notice something, obviously, because I have the thought, oh, I'm anxious. And I'm like, well, am I anxious? And I check in, and maybe I'm anxious, but anxious feels a lot like excitement in my body and in many people's bodies. So starting to really cultivate a relationship where I can really sit closely and be like, are you anxious or are you excited? Because that's a very different way to approach something if you're approaching it with anxiety or if you're approaching it with excitement. And also practicing noticing your body so you can start to associate sensations, or if you are a more visual person, starting to notice when you have things that start to kind of come in your mind's eye that are associated with feelings. So we can start putting words to the felt experience, so we can begin to communicate them to our loved ones, to our coworkers, to our therapists. That was like my initial thing was like, this is so important. It really helps in therapy. But I realize it also just helps with anyone who you have important conversations with. You might notice, oh, it actually feels like something's keeping the words in my throat. And then you can say like, this is hard to talk about. Can you be patient with me?
Right.
That can really change a conversation.
So your work is so physical and so much about the body and the internal world. What made you decide to write a book about this physical work that you do?
Sure. Yeah. I think, the book came to me, right? The book was like, you're going to write me. And then there was like the kind of exploring why that would be a good thing. But I had sat down to do I was creating a lead magnet. I was like trying to get, to build my mailing list marketing. I was like, I have this new practice. I want to mail. Let me tell you, my mailing list is still not great because I never did the lead magnet. I sat down to make a lead magnet.
You wrote a whole entire book instead. Okay, that's the long way.
I'll write an ebook. I'm a good writer. Yes. I'm a good writer. I'll write a little ebook. And then this is what I want to put in it. And it was 11 chapters. And I was like, that is not a free book. That is a book. But it just felt like, yes, I need to not focus on the lead magnet or whatever marketing stuff and I was like, this is what I want to do. I just felt really like I had to. And then I try to be really intentional with my choices about what I do, especially professionally. And I was like, well, does that align with my mission? I have a background actually in strategic planning from before becoming the gym rat. So, I have my mission, my vision, my values. I have all that mapped out. And I was like, does this align with my mission? And it 100% did, which is to make these tools available to as many people as possible. Right. And a book is, you can take it out of the library, or you can buy it for much less than a personal training session with me. At the time, there were a few people doing the work. And I was like, I'm one person. I can help 6 people a week, or I can give people who could probably start to do this work on their own the tools to do it. So it just really felt like in a wonderful way, access was basically one of my main motivators. And this was a great way to increase access because you can only do so much.
I love that. And what I really like about your story is that it started as a, just a marketing exercise that sounds a bit inconsequential in the way that, I mean, it's just a free thing that I'm going to put out there and people can download it. And the purpose is to build my mailing list and to build my business. And where it wound up was back in this activist space where you're writing with a deep personal mission to fulfill your own deep personal mission to affect change. So I'm really, really big on shining a spotlight on what I call unabashedly the selfish reasons for writing. And this is about sharing your gift with the world in a way that also rewards you in some way. And so, yeah, 100%. That can be monetary, but it can also be about like, this feels like this is my purpose on earth, is to kind of, to create this community and bring awareness and enlightenment to this area of the human experience. And I won't be done until I've done this thing.
Yes. Yes. Before I did this work, I remember I would wake up and I would be like, oh, am I sick? Cause I don't want to go to work today. It was really like kids who were always hoping for a sick day. Yeah. I had that with a lot of my work, and I never had this with this work.
Well, it's a good way to call in illness, isn't it? If you're constantly hoping for a sick day, it's a good way to kind of like manifest psychosomatic, like pretty serious symptoms to keep you from engaging with the life that you've created but don't want to live.
Exactly. Is a better option, this option. Yeah, for sure.
So what was the process like of writing the book? And again, you came at this from a sort of like, this is a strategic thing. And then like, oh, maybe it's going to be more than what I expected. But I don't believe it was in your mind deeply connected to that, what you said, that closet sort of essay writing side of yourself, right?
Not at all.
Right. These are like
my closet
two
essays.
different things.
My closet essays were saved in a document, on my laptop for no one to see. Sometimes I would submit them places, but because I never let anyone see them, they weren't very good because you need feedback. So they never got placed anywhere, but you
didn't think of this as part of that, right? You didn't think of this book as part of your personal writing practice. Yeah. Right, textbook.
This was going to be a textbook. I was going to remove it from myself. Oh, nice and safe over there.
Just the expert on high. I'm just here on my podium sharing my knowledge with you people out there, but this is not about me, right? And
100% background as a very strong academic writer, a grant writer. I was like, I can follow an instruction. I can tell a good story without it being too personal. And I looked at all this material and I was like, well, I have a book. I have no idea how a book happens. And I reached out to a high school friend of mine who I had a vague idea, did something that helped people know what publishing was like. And that wound up being Lisa Weinert, who wound up being my literary coach, my writing coach. And she helped me cultivate a process and a practice around writing. And I was going to write a textbook. And every time I started to, and we started to write, she called them buckets, all the things I wanted to include in the book. And then, things to support what the knowledge I was conveying. And we started to think about some personal stories, and, they were sort of client-based, but I had a lot of my own personal stories. And when I would sit down to write anything, all I would want to write are my personal stories.
It's the stories.
That's really interesting. And and it became very clear to me that that the book was not going to be a textbook. And that it was going to be in this, hybrid space of like, a cross-genre space rather of this information and some elements of personal narrative.
So
and I loved it.
Was it scary? How did it feel? I know that you said that the stories were leaping out of you, but to think about actually showing them to an editor, much less like the book buying public, how did it feel to sort of put yourself out there forget about marketing or sharing it online, but even just to put it in a Word document that or Google Doc that is going to be read by another human. How did that feel? That's like step number 1 of going public. It's just like show it to one
that's
editor.
a really great question. I'm trying to think. So like the first person who really read anything ever would be Lisa. And I'm glad you asked this because I did not remember. It took I was so cagey. I would not show her any. She was very patient. She was very patient with me. I wouldn't show her anything. I don't remember how I finally acquiesced, but it was so hard. I think it was easier. Remember I said I sent those essays out in the past and never got placed anywhere. That was faceless, right? Like that was like, and everybody tells you have to submit a lot and get rejected a lot. Like that's the famous story about writing, right? So it's like, it felt kind of safe and faceless, but I had a real intention of like, no, this is going to be a book. It's going to be a public facing book. And so I am going to have to let people read it. And I'm going to start with Lisa. And it was so hard, but it helped. And that was the thing I learned really quickly. Something that I think, even though I had even read stuff about craft and had sort of read this, I really hadn't internalized until I went through the process how many people it takes to actually write a book. It's not just you alone typing away or writing away. I'm a typer. There is plenty of that. It's important. It's coming from you, but especially for me who has no formal training as a writer in this way, and a real desire to learn about, I like to learn about things, right? So I was really curious. And so I began to see, when people read your stuff, they care, they want to help you. And so I was able to learn. And one thing I wound up loving after all this time not wanting to share my book was all the different types of editors and like learning from them about writing. And letting people look at it.
Talk us through your process a little bit. Like you wrote, and then who did you work with, and how did that go? Just briefly, sort of, what did the life cycle of getting the manuscript out and polished look like for you?
Sure. So it was, I sort of started with these things that I wanted to put into the book, and the book slowly over time began to take shape. And
you first had an outline that you and Lisa had developed an outline together, right? So
right. Yes.
Yeah.
The outline, we started with just the things, all the things that were going to go in there. And then the things went into that. Then we outlined it from that list, which was actually really helpful. I had only ever thought you start with an outline, but to actually take everything and dump it out on the floor and then look at it all and then make an outline was beautiful. Over time, it became clear that I have a real rhythm in my writing that has held true, which is 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off. People say you have to write every day or you have to write this way. I don't know if it's the moon. I don't know what it is. I have a very productive 2 weeks. And then I have these 2 weeks, which now, because I've been writing ever since, I've realized that in those sort of 2 weeks off, that's when I need to fill up again. Right. And so, I've been going to a lot of art museums because for me, that is fulfilling, like that fills me up, that fills my creative cup. If I'm stuck on a story, if I go to a museum, it fixes it.
Amazing. I've never heard anyone say that, but I could totally see how that would be. Yeah, because it's just a sort of a expansive environment. You put your mind in a sort of a non-linear, non-literal sort of state, and you move into more of a free associative way of thinking, I guess. That's so interesting. I'm going to try that.
Yeah, I know. Go to a museum. And if I'm not sometimes I'm in Massachusetts, and there are certainly some museums, but what I have really a abundance of by my home in Massachusetts is hiking and nature, which,
My favorite.
so that's the other thing, right? Like, so those
Yeah.
are my things. On my weeks off,
Mhm.
the wins, and it's not that I won't write if some writing comes to me, but it's just not going to be nearly as productive as those 2 weeks on.
Hmm.
So I really just began to honor that practice, honor the fact that at the time, and it seems to be shifting now. And that's, I always just thinking about like the wellness work I do with clients and stuff, our lives change. So things shift. At the time it was consistent morning was the best
Mhm.
time for me to write. It's still morning. It's just been like the middle of the night morning, which is a different practice that I've been
Uh-huh.
engaging in. But yeah, so it's like, okay, I'm an early riser. I'm a morning person. I get up, have, pour my cup of coffee and start writing. And depending on what point in the process, there were times where when I was writing, it helped me to be around people early on in the
Mhm.
process. Actually, I worked in a co-working space.
Mhm.
Um, and I would have headphones so I couldn't hear them, but just having it around. And it was, I worked at the Wing in the original
Mhm.
Wing, which was a very pretty place. And I think
Mhm.
that it's like the museums that helps me. Um, and then there were times where I needed nothing and I needed to be like closed off. And I would work in a
Mhm.
study carrel at NYU where like
Mhm.
I would have a fluorescent light and a wall. And I'd bring like my
Right.
few little
Right.
things. I had a few little
Just no
crystals and a
stimulation,
clock.
no distractions. Right. Yeah.
And it just depended. And so I think the people was often when I was writing about some of the more challenging stuff that was putting me in touch with my past.
Uh-huh.
That would help me stay present and feel resourced and not alone. But once I sort of got that stuff out and I really needed to like edit or really write about some of the more textbook like stuff, I really needed
Mhm.
to be clear, like focused, and there was nothing potentially triggering about it. Alone, quiet.
That's so interesting. So I love that you said that. I was going to ask you how you employed trauma informed sort of mindfulness or self-care around the writing, because I imagine that just as that material can be triggering for a reader to read, it must have been triggering for you to write about it as well. And what I hear you saying in even the way that you honored and acknowledged your rhythm, which was like 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off. Nobody was going to tell you that was the wrong way to do it, because your body and your own kind of energy flow was telling you that it was right for you. So that alone is so self-aware and so self-validating. So yeah, so I was going to ask, like, how did that self-awareness and self-validation and trauma-informed approach to yourself show up when you were hitting really sensitive material?
Yeah. That's a really good question. I had to learn, what we were talking about before with the like, you could come in and smash the weights or you could do really slow squats. I had to
Yeah.
learn to do slow squats with writing. What was happening was I would produce terrible writing and I would become totally dysregulated. And then Lisa would look at it and she'd be like, slow down. And I was like, right.
Wait, do you feel like in a way that you were trying to just rush through it because it was
Yeah.
so difficult to write about? You were just like,
it was the Rolfing. It was the Rolfing
Right.
of the Rolfing of the writer's mind.
Oh God, that sounds even more painful than the body.
And so this is why it's important to have people too, because I know all of this and I still had to have somebody say to me, hey, Laura, notice your body and slow down.
Right.
And I was like, all I needed was the cue. I knew how. I'd been cultivating all these tools to slow down. And that is something I definitely talk with people about, which is helping. We're all going to have different things. For me, having a clock within view was very important. So like my cell phone, the blank screen is the clock, and I would have just a little stand with me wherever I would work that my phone was on so I could see it. So I could track time, because otherwise I might just spend 3 hours not moving, just in this past place. My body feeling and like not even knowing it, right? Squeezing everything and typing. And producing not great writing. But if I had the clock there, my eyes would drift to it every so often. Every 20 minutes, get up. I drink a tremendous amount of water and coffee. Go up and refill your cup, look around. And
so take
really
yourself out of like the head and the imagination from time to time and reorient to the space that you're in.
Yeah.
Remind yourself that you're a human being in present time and not a bundle of memories that lives in the ether.
Exactly. And cap it, right? So during those productive 2 weeks, there are times where part of me has the capacity to sit there and write for 6 hours, which is, I suffer a meal, but that is not good writing. Just because I can churn out writing for 6 hours doesn't make it good writing. And, there's a time and a space to write like that, but I was writing for a book that I wanted people to learn from. So that should be good writing. And so capping myself at 2 hours, which is still a long time.
And speaking of good writing, you have done some very good writing in this book. Talk to me about the editor and author relationship. You had a couple of different editors. Tell me like what was that experience like for you, and was any of it like new or surprising?
I mean, I had no idea what I was getting into, so it was all new and surprising and generally very delightful. I really do like to be edited. I didn't know that, so that was one of the surprises. Oh, I like this. That was nice. That's a pleasant surprise. I will say, by the time you get to like the last round of edits, like I was like, I do not want to look at my manuscript anymore. But I still appreciated it because I did feel like I learned a lot. So I had, I worked with one editor, Jennifer, on sort of first pass, sort of substantive edits.
Big picture stuff,
big picture stuff, and like reorganizing. One thing that I learned a lot about in the act of doing it was reorganizing. That's something that has long been a struggle of mine. I knew it was a thing, and I knew this would be an opportunity to begin to learn how to organize my thoughts better in these sort of longer form writing. So there was a lot of that, and she was wonderful pairing for me. She has a background in yoga and Ayurveda and an interest in the trauma-informed work. So she was having somebody like that help me write about movement. There are exercises in the book where there are no photos, and I am giving people, sometimes they are like physical exercise. So to have another person with an experience of explaining movement helping me in this part of the process was tremendous. Because I know from coaching that sometimes the way I would think of how to explain a movement that would make sense to me doesn't always make sense to somebody else. So to be able to put two minds together was really tremendous for that. And then it came your way, the manuscript. And so, I worked with your team, and it was like what I was learning was, so, and it made so much sense, was you start with this much bigger picture, and with each pass you're narrowing your focus until it's, proofreading, punctuation. And as the author, I was like, I don't want to read this book anymore.
So,
this is words on a page.
Right. And then it was time to send the book out there in the world. And that's obviously the sort of like the whole another level of going public and sharing your ideas, sharing, in your case, also your stories, not just stories, but stories about a very personal aspect of life. Actually, so I want to ask you about like what marketing the book was like, but before I forget, I really want to ask you about this question of boundaries and privacy, because I know that, I mean, it's an issue for every single person that writes a book, especially if there's any of their own personal story in it, but especially for you, because that you're writing about trauma and because you are so mindful and attendant to like choices that are going to promote wellness and not distress you further. So talk to me about where you set the boundaries around sharing your personal story in the book and then also talking about it in media.
Yeah. So that's actually back to like when I was like, I have this idea for a book. And one thing that's a big part of my work before even writing the book was that I made a decision intentionally to never, in this sort of public forum, so it's not never. I mean, I definitely have told people in my life, I never publicly share my trauma story.
The details of what happened. That's not,
the details of what happened. And, not even really the headline. I think it can be inferred sometimes. But it's just not something that I cared to discuss publicly. And when I started to do the work at all, which was for me, while I was doing it, it was also in part, it was doing advocacy and talking that this should be a thing. And I was drawing from my own experiences. I realized I don't owe anyone my trauma story. And so that's what made it possible for me to even begin to do the work. And then when it came time to write the book, by that point, I had been exposed to some press and some interviews, and there were a number of really big publications that were interested in what I was doing, but I wouldn't give them the trauma story.
And they all wanted that.
I know
they
it
were like,
sells.
well, tell us what happened. Yeah. And
or tell
were
us
they
your
hinging their
client
interest
stories.
on that, or?
Because it sells, right? Like,
Yeah.
We're humans. We like these stories. I mean, I think about all people. And this is not. It sounds like I'm judging. I'm not. People really love like true crime podcasts and all that stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Like that doesn't resonate with me. It resonates with so many people for a reason. Like we like these stories, and at the end of the day, it's a good way to pitch a story. It's a good way to sell a story.
It's also very much of the time. We live in a very sort of like open disclosure culture right now, very kind of like confessional, very sort of, and so I think that it is counterintuitive even to be, met by the sort of assertion that like, I don't owe it to you to tell you what happened to me. I can still talk about the fact that I live with trauma without sort of showing you my receipts.
Exactly. And what I think is so interesting is that a lot of that was before Me Too, for sure. Like I remember reading like XO Jane, and it happened to me. And there was this real like market online for these trauma unprocessed, we're talking about not having a trauma informed approach to your writing. So it's not self-aware, it's not processed. And there's a lot of that out there. I feel like in the early 2010s, 20 teens, I don't know. And with Me Too, what was so interesting to me, it's horrifying to me, to be perfectly honest, people started just unprocessed sharing of these terrible things that happened to them on social media. And that is antithetical to how Me Too started, which was a way to, Tarana Burke's idea of, we don't need to go into the details because it's not always safe to disclose.
Right.
You can just say Me Too and form that connection.
Right.
The Me Too of it is enough. And I loved that. And that wasn't what I was seeing. What I was seeing was a lot of people traumatizing themselves, and the secondary trauma, in my book being so thoughtful. You go to, at the time, Facebook was mostly like recipes and like dumb pet videos. So, and then and I went on one day and I was seeing these horror stories, and I was like, and I had still really signed on to like look at dogs. So I was, that
you're
was
talking
really
about
jarring.
those early days of the Me Too movement when people were flooding Facebook and social media with their unprocessed trauma stories, not just saying Me Too, but also actually my boss did this and my family member did that and a stranger did, all the things that happened. Yeah. It actually
I'm
reminds
looking,
me, if I can just digress
yeah,
for a sec, Laura, it reminds me of like what you were saying earlier about how we, in our language, we make reference to our feelings in a physical way. So like I'm thinking of the phrase spilling your guts, when you're when
mm.
you're sharing your unfiltered, unprocessed emotional content, it really is like you're spilling your guts. And that sounds painful and
And also,
not
it
healthy.
depends on like, I guess we're going to continue with this gross metaphor, but like the container, what are you spilling into, right? And for
Right.
some people, and it's wonderful, you get that story out and you're met with equanimity and I'm so sorry that happened to you.
And I'm here for you. And right. Mm-hmm.
But a lot of the time it's like, well, maybe what were you wearing, right? Or
Right.
why were you out by yourself?
Or on the
Were you
internet, just
flirting?
full on trolls, where
Oh,
it could actually
yes,
just be cruel and just sort of like, making some derogatory comment about your appearance or about your whatever.
100%. And so if you are not resourced, like emotionally to handle that, um, that's going to be very harmful to have then shared. You want to share really thoughtfully. And so for me, my feeling was if I just put it out there, um, I didn't know what I was going to be met with. And when I started doing the work with clients, I had made a lot of progress, but I was still doing a lot of my own processing.
Right. Right.
And so it started as a self-protective measure, but I began to realize pretty quickly that I was setting an example for other people who maybe wanted to be more private, but felt they couldn't, shouldn't, that we are supposed to disclose all the time, that's how you
Or
get
to
help.
find community
And
without necessarily like, if I reach out to another person and ask for, some connection and support around my trauma, does that automatically mean I have to tell everything that happened? Or can I still enter into this space and ask for support while also maintaining boundaries around how much I share? That's a radical
exactly,
idea. It's like, you don't,
exactly.
yeah. So it's like sitting in the circle at the support group saying, I'm just going to tell you that I'm here. I'm just going to
I
tell you
belong.
whatever I feel like I want to tell you, but no more. Right.
Yeah. And I realized pretty quickly that people were finding that liberating, from my
Mm-hmm.
clients, because I began to sort of very publicly start to say, I don't tell people my story publicly, and you don't
Yeah.
have to either. And to work with me, when I was doing the personal training work, clients were invited to disclose. I'm always there to listen. You don't have to. I don't need to know the story to do the work because what I am working with
Mm-hmm.
is how it's showing up in the body.
So
Um,
how did all of this play into when you were talking about the book? So that's how
yeah,
it informed the way that you wrote about it. You wrote about your trauma in a very boundaried way, and then to actually have the book go out there in the world and
yeah.
be interviewed about it, etc. How has it felt for you to be even just like dealing with this material in a public forum? And how do you care for
Yeah.
yourself through that?
I was terrified before it happened. I mean, you know that. We had some conversations.
I mean,
Um,
even
and
without the trauma aspect, just literally kind of like, having people read your book is scary, scary, scary for most
scary.
authors. So yeah. So how did you care for yourself
But by the
emotionally
time
when it went out there?
when it went out, um, by then, it was a process. And I realized, I was like, people started asking me like, so how does it feel? Because I would see like my book online, people reading my book like on Instagram or whatever. They're like, how
Right.
does it feel? And I was like, it feels okay. And I had done so much work through the process of writing the book. And when this question of the story would come up, the way in the end we handled not telling the story was pretty artful
Mm-hmm.
because there's sometimes you need to contextualize.
Mm-hmm.
So I just represented the story with empty brackets.
Mm-hmm.
People loved it.
Mm-hmm.
And one thing I hadn't, and it was, I'm going to take care of my nervous system. I'm going to take care of your nervous system. You don't need to hear the horror story. You just need to know that there is a story, like you were saying about the circle.
Mm-hmm.
One of my friends who's a writer had read it. She's a poet. And she was like, thank you for the brackets. She has her own story, which I know. It's nothing like my story.
Mm-hmm.
And she was like, I was able to put my story in those brackets.
Oh, wow. So that really, aside from giving permission to readers to hold space for themselves, you also gave them an entry point into the material so they can imagine themselves in the advice that you're sharing right there. Yeah.
The book is about the healing story. It's not about the trauma story. And
Yeah.
we need a break from that. Like
Yeah.
when we are doing healing work and we're engaging, we're like, especially we're in talk therapy and we're grappling with the narrative, we can start to feel like we are our trauma. We are not.
Mm-hmm.
We are never
Mm-hmm.
our trauma. That is one thing that has happened in our life and that we're working to integrate into our story. That is way less interesting than to me than what your favorite dessert is. And how did you learn to do the cool skill that you're doing now? That's what I want to know.
Well, and I
realized,
love the stories of healing too. I love the sort of how do you care for yourself? I want to know from people, what I can borrow from their practice that might be useful and helpful to me. So in the time that we have left, Laura, I would love to ask you, where it sounds like that writing this book was in some ways a healing process for you.
100%.
And an integration of the lost, disowned creative writer that you never wanted to share with the world, and the the expert facilitator who has this wise advice to share. Those two sides of the self came together in lifting heavy things. But where has that left you as a writer, and how are you seeing yourself as a writer now, and as you go forward into the next chapter in your life?
Yeah, after the book came out, there was a lot of writing to promote the book. And so I kept writing. And I think I would have kept writing anyway, but, I really there was never a stop in the practice of okay, it's the morning. It's part of my productive 2 weeks. So I'm going to write. So I have continued to write, and I noticed that I wanted to write, people wanted me to write more like the book. And I was like, but I want to write personal essays. And I started to realize I could. So I have been leaning in and writing much more memoir, really working on building my literary muscles, much more lyrical prose, because it's fun, man. I love it. And so I have been writing consistently the whole time. And
that's remarkable. I just want to pause for a second and say,
really?
Wow, that's actually kind of remarkable, because that does not automatically happen to everybody who writes their first book. Very often it's thank God I don't have to wake up and do that anymore today or ever again. But for
I was
you,
so
it sounds
sad.
like you hit your stride with it. Yeah. Oh, so
I need a project.
How do you decide what to write about now if it's not, in aid of this very clearly defined goal? There
are a couple things. I go to the museum. It does work.
It does help that you live in Manhattan.
It does help. A lot of the time, I'll just get we'll start with a turn of phrase or an image that then has words with it. And it gets stuck in my head like a song lyric. And I just sit down and start to explore it. And I have a lot of things where it's one paragraph that didn't really turn into much, but maybe it will later. Or those essays that I wrote so long ago, the ones that still stay with me. I'm not using the whole things, but I'm pulling things from that. I do have I do have a piece coming out in a literary journal soon, and it's more of a collage piece, and it involves museum, and it involves pieces from a story I wrote that never went anywhere in the early to like 2011, I guess. I've tried my hand at some poetry. Some of that has been repurposed into more of a lyrical essay form, but yeah, I just, I have I have some things that I've started and I just sort of mess with. And then sometimes it's just free writing. I've finally started doing practice pages.
Okay. Yeah.
So yeah, just playing.
So
it's playtime.
That's amazing. That's amazing. And that was what I was going to ask you. It's amazing that you got somebody to pick your essay up. You're going to be published in a journal. That's cool. Cause I was going to ask you, like, all right, now that you're writing all this sort of like pure artistic, creative stuff, that's a whole nother level of scary, and vulnerability and, being seen. And so I was going to ask you if you've actually started sending stuff out. So you have. What do you want to share the details? Where is it going to be published and by whom?
So it's a newer, it's a Toronto-based literary journal called Archetype, which really speaks to me. I like that a lot. And what I actually really liked about them when I found them was they talk, you see a lot of journals, they say, we support new emerging writers. But there's no sort of, maybe they do, maybe they don't, we don't know. This journal, not only do they say that, they really put their money where their mouth is and they share resources. And it was a very lovely experience, actually. I was super pumped when I found them. I liked it. I'm excited for them. And
do you know when the piece is going to come out, or what?
22nd. November 22nd is the launch. No, that's not right. It's before that. It's in November.
Okay, November of 2022, which, we are recording this in late October, and our podcast episode may not air until after your piece is out. So people should go to Archetype and look for Laura Khoudari. I am so impressed with you that you are doing that you're taking this transformational experience that you had writing, lifting heavy things for other people, and you're now diving deeper into the great unknown of the creative landscape within. So, and sharing it.
It makes me really brave. It's just like, it's so rewarding. So I just keep being brave about it, and it keeps paying off.
Awesome. So. That's great. Well, Laura, thank you so much for joining me. We will put all your kind of details in the show notes, but can you also verbally just let people know where they can find you if they want to follow along your writing exploits?
Yeah. So my website, I always say, if you can spell my name, you can find me. So my website is laurakhoudari.com. So that's LauraKhoud, D like David, ARI. And that is, my name is also my Instagram handle. I'm not terribly active on Twitter, but that's my Twitter handle. And I'm the only Laura Khoudari. So when you Google me,
in the world,
it's me.
Yeah.
There's a hyphenate. There's a hyphenate who I think maybe married a cousin or something.
Okay. Well.
But yes. So I'm pretty findable that way. And I'm most active these days on Instagram.
Great. Awesome. Well, thank you again so much. It's been a wonderful conversation.
It's been a pleasure, Maggie, as always.
I really hope this conversation has inspired you to give so much of your gift to the world that it expands you into your greatest possible version of yourself. Remember, it's not selfish just because we also benefit from it. And here's where I get to make a selfish request. New podcasts need all the help they can get. If you enjoyed this episode, please rate the show and subscribe to us on your favorite platform. Don't forget to follow us on Instagram at Selfish Gift Podcast. And send me a DM. I'd love to hear how you're sharing your gift with the world.